Thank you, Joyce. Today, I had a whole new preaching series I was going to start with you. I had a title picked out. I had scripture lessons planned. I'd even done a little bit of the research. And in the time leading up to my trip to China, I thought, Daryl, you're probably not going to have it in you to start a new series that first Sunday back. So I stepped back, and I had this overwhelming sense that I needed to share with you everything that God had done for my family and through my family throughout this process of adoption. As I sat back and I began to put all of it together, I became amazed more and more at really how much God was at work through this entire process for us. So you need to know a little bit about my family to understand why we decided to go with adoption. When Debbie and I got married, we always decided that we wanted to have children. That was always a part of our life together. But when we tried to conceive our first child, it was met with a lot of difficulty. In fact, it took us 5 years to conceive Parker. We went to numerous doctors and specialists. We tried all sorts of procedures, all sorts of things that they asked us to do, and nothing worked. In fact, it was actually between procedures one time where the doctor looked at Debbie and I and said, God has done more amazing things than this, that she actually conceived. And throughout the pregnancy, even though there was difficulty in getting pregnant, there were no difficulties during the pregnancy. And Parker was born a very happy, very healthy 9-pound, 3-ounce boy. Well, we had Parker for several years, and we decided we wanted to add to the family. And again, we were met with resistance to the pregnancy process. Debbie had a hard time. It didn't take 5 years, but it did take 3. And we were finally blessed with Wesley. Now, we've had these 2 boys in our family for many years. And when Debbie and I had the problems in the beginning, we had always talked about adoption, that if we could not have biological children of our own, that we would pursue adoption so that we could have children in our family. Well, from my thought, after having 2 children, we no longer needed the adoption process. I had dismissed it. Well, Debbie began to have health issues in 2010, and we went to the doctor, and the doctor shared with us that she needed to have a partial hysterectomy. And I will never forget the look on Debbie's face when the doctor looked at us and said, once we do this procedure, you will no longer be able to have children of your own. Her face was just one of horror and shock. And so I encouraged her to get the procedure, to have it done, and that if we felt our family was not complete, we could once again look at adoption. After all, it wasn't like we had never talked about it before. So she had the procedure done. And about 1.5 years ago, she came up to me and she said, I'm not finished. And I said, you're not finished with what? And she said, I want more children. Well, my first thought was, we have Parker and Wesley. Parker, this wonderful, intelligent, independent, quiet child. And Wesley, this rowdy, active, all-stop and no-go child. And when Debbie came up to me and said, I want to have more, my first thought was I wanted to reintroduce her to Wesley because surely she had forgotten about him if she wanted to add to our family. But we had the conversation. In fact, we went to the Santos Trailhead and we did a 7-mile hike. And we talked about all of the pros and cons of adoption, the time that it would take, the financial impact that it would leave. Would we be able to be good parents to whatever child we ended up adopting? And then Debbie posed the question to me, what does your adopted child look like? And without hesitation, I replied, Chinese. I don't know why, but in my mind, all the times I had ever thought about adoption, as far back as I can remember, I always thought of a little Chinese child. Well, much to my surprise, Debbie responded that it was the same for her. So after many miles and more mosquito bites, we had come to the conclusion that we were going to pursue the information gathering for international adoption. Now, when you do an international adoption, it is a rather lengthy process. This is one of 3 notebooks that we put together throughout the process, and each one of these pages is front and back with a different application or form or article that we had to read and go through and do. Now, the first thing you do when you adopt internationally is you interview your adoption agency. You find one that will work for you. So we called several. And we settled on one called Lifeline International Adoption. And they specialize in international adoption. So we said, send us over the packet. Tell us what all we have to do. I got the packet, and I printed it out, and I was absolutely stunned at everything we would have to go through. This first page is our checklist. There's a home study you have to do. There's an I-800 application you have to fill out. You have to apply to immigration. You have to put together a dossier. You have to send it all to China. They have to log it in, translate it, authenticate it, receive it, and approve it. Then they come back to you, and you have to go back to immigration once again. You have to be fingerprinted. You have to have several people write letters of recommendation vouching for your ability to be a parent. Then you have to send over more forms, more letters, and more applications. They have to translate them, authenticate them, log them in. And then the Chinese government gets to decide whether or not you're fit for adoption. Whew. We did all of that. We sent all of that in, and painstakingly we waited through each and every step of the process. Because if there is a glitch or a hiccup, sometimes you have to go all the way back. There's things that you have to redo, things that you have to undo, things that you have to prove, more steps you have to take to satisfy the Chinese government that you are a worthy candidate for adoption. Well, then you have to go through the files, and you have to read the painstaking, heartbreaking stories of these children that are in an orphanage. There are 1 million children in the Chinese orphanage system right now. We had the opportunity to go back to Davis's orphanage to look at those children, some which are just laying on a rubber foam mat with no interaction, no nurturing. We watched lunchtime, a handful of white steamed rice, a little bit of beef stirred together, and that was lunch. Breakfast was a handful of rice, dinner was a handful of rice, and that was it. It absolutely broke your heart to see what these children endured and what they went through. But we go through this process, we read these stories, we're reading these files, all of these medical conditions that these children are born with. Everything from an oversized birthmark all the way up to and including Down syndrome. Children with club foot, children with spina bifida, children that have fistulas, children that have cleft lips and cleft palates. And we're going through these files and we're praying and we're reading and we're discerning. And I had found a little boy that they had named Zachary. They give them all American names so it doesn't seem so daunting. And so I looked at Zachary and I thought, Zachary sounds really, really good for our family. And I showed him to Debbie, and Debbie, she was kind of lukewarm on the idea. She didn't dislike him, but there was nothing that really grabbed her heartstrings, so I let it go. And we were going through a few months later, and there was another section of the website where there was another little boy. And I forget what his name was, but she looked at him and said, I've seen this child before. And we did some checking and found out that it was, in fact, Zachary from the first one, the one that I had showed her. And at that point, something spoke to Debbie, and that was the boy that she wanted to pursue. So we put in the application. We decided this is the little guy that we wanted to be matched with. So we filled out the paperwork. We got approval from the Chinese government. Department of Homeland Security said you're a go. The Chinese consulate accepted everything, and off we went. Off we went to go to China to adopt this little boy. Now, the one thing that I didn't mention to you about this process is it's not free. Everybody wants a little slice of the American pie to help fund this adoption. There were agency fees that we had to pay to our adoption agency. There were fees that we had to pay to the Chinese government all along the way, all to the point where Wesley asked me one day, how much does Davis cost? So I very quickly had to tell him, we're not buying Davis. We're paying agency fees so that we can pursue this adoption. So as I got the checklist, as I'm thinking about everything that we're going through, I began to question whether or not we are to do this. But what I went back and remembered was on that hike that Debbie and I took, at the end of the hike, we both decided that there was a very real sense of call that had been placed on our lives to go forward with this adoption. And I think that's what made it so easy for us to decide to do this, was that we weren't doing it because we thought it was a neat idea. We weren't doing it because we were bored. We weren't doing it for any of those reasons. We were doing it because we felt God was calling us to do it. So as I looked at that checklist and I looked at that insane amount of money that we did not have, we're not going to have, and how in the world we were going to do this, Debbie and I began to pray. And we prayed just the way that Paul described it in Philippians. Rejoice in the Lord always. And I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. And that became the foundation for how Debbie and I went through this process. You see, there were so many things that we had to do. That list was enormous. The fees were insurmountable. But God was with us each and every step of the way. While those hurdles were numerous, they were not impossible. We got over every single one of them with relative ease. When there were letters of recommendation to be written, we never had a problem finding somebody to essentially vouch for us to 2 different governments. When there were forms to be filled out and sent into those offices where it takes forever to get anything done, our applications were always received, processed, and approved quicker than the normal timeline. And then when we got to the aspect of the finances, we talked to people that had been through it and discovered there are grants out there. There are agencies whose sole purpose is to help families with international adoptions. We applied to 3. The first 2 approved us and gave us almost double their normal gift. The third is actually going to vote on us on Wednesday, so if you need something to pray about, pray for that. Further affirming for Debbie and I that God had called us into this. With this process looking as large and as insurmountable as it did in the beginning, He was with us each and every step of the way. While the hurdles were numerous, none of them were impossible. I lived a life of awe the last several months as all of this started to come together. As the clouds sort of parted, as the clarity became apparent that this was going to happen. That everything was going to be approved, that we were going to be able to make it, we were going to be able to pay for it. Everything was going to work. But there was one last hurdle that we had to climb, and that was the acceptance of our families, and for Debbie and I, our congregations. So we go to our families and we express to them this call that we have. And how did they respond? They were excited. They were overjoyed. You know, I expected some pushback from my great-grandmother and a few other people, but all of them were so excited that we were going to do this. The only thing they did was ask just a few questions to help them understand the process. How long does it take? What agency are you going through? Things like that. So then came the next hurdle. You guys. How are you going to respond to this call that had been placed on our lives? Are we going to be met with resistance? Are we going to be met with questions? The questions you asked, the encouragement you gave, the toddler shower that you threw touched Debbie and I deeply. Every person that God had placed in our lives accepted this call without hesitation. In fact, they wanted to know more about it. You all encouraged us each and every step with your prayers, with your gifts, with your questions and your concern. And so I want to thank all of you for allowing Debbie and I to feel the love of God as it coursed through you and you poured it out upon us. You know, it wasn't a trickling, it wasn't a dripping, it was a cup overflowing type of feeling. One that we shared with our families, we shared with the adoption agencies, we shared with the families as we spent time with them in China, expressing to them how much you all supported us. And then we saw that again when we showed up at the airport at a late hour on Friday night, and some of you showed up to greet us. There were 10 or 15 people that showed up, my cousins, my uncles, a young lady that is a pastor in the Tampa area that is half Vietnamese and half Chinese, brought her mother and her 2 nephews to the airport because she read about it on Facebook when we were landing. They all came out to greet us. And my brother and my sister-in-law threw us a get-to-know Davis party yesterday at my mom and dad's house, and about 40 people came out just to see the little guy. That is the wonderful thing about call. When a call is placed on your life, though it may seem difficult, though it may seem insurmountable, it's not impossible. God will equip you. God will go with you each and every step of the way to make sure you make it to the end. All of us have received a call in our lives at some point, in some fashion, for something. So today I want to encourage you that when that call comes, answer it. Say yes. Go boldly to where God is calling you to go. You will not regret it. You will not be sorry. In fact, I have a really good feeling you'll be amazed at how God will begin to work in your life through the process of that call. My prayer life is a very realistic prayer life. I don't pray for anything out of the park. I don't pray for anything over the top. It's always very realistic. And I think I do that because I don't like to be disappointed. Throughout this process, I have been trained that Gotcha Day, the day where you are united with your child, is always a day of grief. That this child is going to cry, this child is going to fuss, that you are not going to have the ability to console them, that you just simply have to endure it. And they teach us that because not when you do an international adoption, you are going to meet a child that oftentimes has never seen anybody that looks like you. We were told specifically for Davis that Davis had never seen a white person. He had grown up only among Chinese people. That we were going to look different, act different, talk different. We were even going to smell different. And that he is going to be introduced, given to this group of white people, and leave everything that he has ever known. Go into a situation where he has no way to communicate, and that he is simply going to grieve. They said, don't feel bad. It's just the way it's going to be. Hopefully, it'll only be a few days or weeks for you, but it could last several months up to a year. So my prayer through this entire process was, let there not be too much crying. Let the grief not last too long. Let it be days rather than weeks, certainly not months. Give us some ability to provide peace to this little boy. And that was my prayer, over and over and over again. Well, it's 3:45 a.m. on Gotcha Day. And I sit straight up in bed. I never get up at 3:45 in the morning. So I get out my phone and I play a few games on my phone. I open up a little Kindle app. I read a little bit out of several different books, hoping that something will allow me to go back to sleep because I know what is waiting for me later that day. Well, finally, I get the old V8 commercials. I should have had a V8. Well, I get this old impression, stupid, pray. So I get out of bed, I get on my knees, and I begin to pray. I thought, God has something he wants to tell me. And so I'm quiet. I'm listening. Nothing. Not a word. So I begin to pray. I begin to do that realistic prayer again. Let today be a day with few tears. Let today be a day that the grief does not last forever. Let today not be too bad. And for some reason, I stopped. And I began to recount in my mind everything that God had done up to that point. The mountains that he had moved on our behalf, the doors that he had opened, the amazing things that he had done each and every step of the way. And I thought, how dare you undersell God? And so I switched. I said, you know what? I want no tears. I want no grief. I want him to come to me and Debbie excited. My mom and dad went with us. I want him to go to Grandmommy and Granddaddy with a huge smile on his face. I want this to be the best adoptive transition in the history of humanity. And I said, I know through you, you can do it. And that's what I expect today. And I said, amen. I felt exhausted, and I went back to bed. Now, the time comes. 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We're on the bus. We go to the adoption agency in China. We're sitting in the room with about 5 to 6 other families, and the lady calls out, Chen Lian Yun. That's his Chinese name that he was assigned. It's not anything specific, it's nothing that was meant for him. It was what was given to him based on a formula from the orphanage he was in and what number of child he was that was brought in that year. So we go over, and there he is. He's walking to us. Debbie and I very slowly, very easily bend down to get on our knees to be at his level, and we say hi. And he looks at us, He doesn't cry. I put out my hands, and he puts his arms up, and he comes to me. I had a little toy Thomas the Train in my hand. I gave it to him, and he begins to run it up my arm, down my back. I say he hugged me, but down my back and down my other arm. I hold him for a few minutes, and I know Mama's standing right there, so I can't hold him forever. So I pass him off to Debbie. He puts his arms out to her. She takes him. He does the same thing with her. We take our boys, and I gave the boys a little ball that we had bought for him. It's one of those where you throw it on the ground and it starts to flash all sorts of colors. And Parker bounces it, gets it to flash, and then hands it to him. He throws it, it bounces. He begins to laugh. The boys start to chase it with him. For the next 10 or 15 minutes, they're running around the floor, knocking all sorts of people over, chasing this ball with Davis. And he is just laughing. He runs back over to me. We fall on the ground, and for the next 30 minutes, we roll on the floor of this adoption agency, and he is giving out these soulful, deep belly laughs with every bit that he is. Mom and Dad are hanging out in the background, kind of apprehensive, because we told them, you need to be a ghost today. Just let us get to know him. Let us try and help him. If it works out, you'll get some hugging time with your new grandchild. Well, I picked him up and I walked him over and I showed him to my mom and my dad, and he went to both of them just as easily as he went to us. It was the perfect transition. And throughout this entire process of him getting to know us, there has never been the inconsolable time. He has found great peace and comfort in the arms of his mom and his dad, his brothers, and his grandparents. When you get that call on your life to do as God asks you to do, folks, go boldly. Pray for the home run. Pray for the top and the best of everything, because He will deliver it. He will provide it for you the same way He provided it for us. There was nothing that happened through this process that was done because Debbie and I are great parents or efficient paperwork filler-outers. This all happened because of God, because He was involved at each and every step, because we surrendered everything there was to do over to Him and asked Him to take care of it. And He did it in such an amazing way. So my encouragement for you is, when that call comes, and it will if it hasn't already, say yes. Answer it. Go boldly. Do everything that He asks you to do, because He will not leave you to do it on your own. He will walk you through each and every step of the way. And He has those blessings just waiting for you to say yes.